Now, Boris Johnson is preparing to unveil sweeping curbs on how unhealthy foods are sold in Britain, with advertising, retail and food executives braced for one of the world's most restrictive marketing regimes. Joining me to discuss the impact of advertising and the obesity issues we face is Professor Carel Le Roux, who's an obesity physician at St. Vincents Hospital, and Charley Stoney, who's Chief Executive of IAPI, which is the Institute of Advertising Practitioners in Ireland, and she's also on the board of the ASAI. Good afternoon to both of you. Thank you very much for joining me. Dr. Le Roux, I'll start with you. Can you tell us how big of an issue obesity has become in Ireland?
Obesity is now one of the major diseases that's driving the mortality, the number of people dying in Ireland. So we know that obesity is one of the biggest risk factors for dying with COVID-19. And we also know that with diabetes and heart disease and cancer, that obesity is a major driver of disease.
How many people die a year from obesity or obesity-related issues in this country?
So in Ireland, approximately a quarter of patients or a quarter of people have obesity as a disease. So it is a massive problem for people living at the moment. And of course, that has problems with quality of life as well as the diseases. But when we actually look at the number of people dying with this disease, we are understanding that it's much higher than we thought, because a lot of these diseases, even like cancer, we now understand that obesity is one of the major risk factors for developing cancer.
So the numbers of people actually, strictly speaking, dying of obesity would be quite low, but how often, or the numbers it contributes to fatalities in, would be huge, high, thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands?
Well, no, I would say that at the moment we think that at least a quarter of deaths that is happening is preventable by addressing obesity. So it's really that big a problem at the moment.
Okay.
And we now think that obesity is one of the most preventable and important drivers of unnecessary deaths.
Right. Define clinical obesity.
So obesity is not defined by how heavy you are. It's defined by whether or not you've got extra fat cells that's causing a disease. So if you think about the entire Ireland rugby team, most of them will have a body mass index above 30, which is the number that we often use, but they do not have obesity. So obesity is a disease that causes other diseases, but we now understand that it's actually a disease of the part of the brain that you and I cannot control by thinking. And relative to this conversation, it's also that it's not a part of the brain that can be affected by advertising. That means that obesity is not a choice. It's a disease that we have to treat in the same way as we treat high blood pressure or high cholesterol levels or diabetes.
Actually, that's a perfect cue to bring Charley Stoney in. Charley Stoney, good afternoon, Chief Executive of IAPI, which is the Institute of Advertising Practitioners in Ireland. Anytime any government, certainly in the Western world, goes on and an obesity lowering drive, advertising seems to be right in the forefront of it. You seem to get it in the neck as if it's your fault. You've just heard one of the country's leading experts there saying it's a disease. It's an aberrant piece of wiring in our brain, and advertising doesn't affect it one way or the other. So I'm sure you welcome hearing that.
I do indeed. In fact, I was just about to say the same thing, and so I'm so glad it came from a scientist, as it were. Otherwise, I wouldn't be believed. But it is true. I think what's happened in the UK is quite misguided. I would say it's actually almost as bad as being sort of lazy policy making. It's obvious that it's a hot potato that the government want to get off their desk. Banning advertising until a 9 p.m. watershed is an easy win for them because it's headline figures and it makes them look like they're doing something. Unfortunately, as a good doctor will probably agree, the root cause of obesity is multifaceted, and certainly you cannot blame advertising for it. The UK's government research actually says states how little it actually has an impact on a child's intake. So I think their research showed that by reducing advertising or by banning advertising until 9 p.m., it reduces a child's intake by a tiny 1.7 calories. It's their own research. So it does seem misguided. I know there's a lot of very strident views on it from the UK point of view. I doubt very much whether the government would impose such a restrictive environment here, given how well we're doing on self-regulation of the statutory codes as it is. I mean, as an advertising body, and the advertisers, the ASAI, the BAI, the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, we take this subject really seriously, and we abide by an incredibly strict code, statutory code already. We base ours mostly on audience figures rather than watersheds, because they're a fairly blunt instrument. I mean, a watershed doesn't take into account most of the teenagers in this country who are watching television well after 9 p.m. So we base it on audience figures. If the program is aimed at children, then we don't have.
Okay, but while you're off the hook in terms of whether advertising is going to affect somebody who is clinically obese or who has that obesity gene or whatever, where you're not off the hook is, and you've just, as you said yourself, you target audiences, you target specific demographics. Now, one of the things that we all know about lifestyle, habits, diet, how we live our lives is the younger we start right, the better the outcomes are going to be. And your industry and the clients that you represent target people younger and younger. And you are not a blunt instrument. You are a very, very sophisticated instrument. And very sophisticated industry, and you know how to get to them, and you know what triggers to push. So do you feel that you are culpable in any way in that respect?
Well, I think, as I said, we take the HFSS statutory code incredibly seriously, and we don't, and we, just as we have the ability to target, we have the ability to avoid target audiences, which is what our regulation is all about. Code is all about. I mean, I think if you look at how susceptible young people are to advertising, they are susceptible to brands. They will, 60% of 15 to 17-year-olds will buy from big brands that they know, but they don't just know those brands from advertising. So obviously advertising plays a part, otherwise our industry wouldn't exist in terms of reinforcing those brand values, but they don't. Advertising, I mean, I wouldn't hold our industry up for being able to change the habits of a whole generation. I mean, it's just simply not possible for one aspect of our lifestyle to do that. So obesity is multifaceted, and I think advertising plays a part in promoting brands and keeping those brands alive in the eyes of consumers. But certainly the way we comply with the HFSS codes here in Ireland, we really can't be held to account.
Okay, so you are utterly law-abiding. You stick to them literally to the letter of them, and if they change, then you will obviously have to do that as well. Professor Le Roux, can I ask you a question? We're talking... What Boris Johnson appears to be doing is, as Charley said, a kind of a blunt instrument. And in some senses, the advertising industry is a very soft target. But let's look at what's in these foods that are being banned. What about the sugar? A member of Barack Obama's FDA on this station a few years ago described sugar as the heroin of the 21st century. Professor Donald O'Shea, who I'm sure you know very well, talks about the combination of sweet and savoury, salt and sugar, as being lethal for healthy diets and for our taste receptors. So instead of going after the junk food, let's go after the stuff that's in the junk food. Would that not be a better way of tackling it?
So if obesity was that simple, what we would have seen is that in the lockdown period, a lot of the fast foods, were shut down. And yet most people will report that they found that their weight increased. So it's not as simple as just removing certain foods out of the diet and then you're going to address the disease. What we do see, however, is that we need multiple approaches. So the public health approach, where, for example, advertising sensibly, and I would agree, there's one thing about abiding by the letter of the law, but another thing is abiding by the spirit of the law. So if we advertise sensibly, what will happen is that the entire population will benefit. So maybe everybody's weight will come down by 1 kilogram or 2 kilograms. That will have a massive impact on the entire population, although it will not help those people with the disease of obesity. So if we then think about the disease of obesity, how to affect that, we find that public health measures are not that helpful for that population. Then we need clinical treatments, be it diet treatments, medication, or surgery. And a really good example for this is high blood pressure. High blood pressure is a disease, and if we can reduce the entire population's salt intake, all of our blood pressures will be a little bit lower, and that will have a massive impact. But if you have somebody with severe high blood pressure, you are not going to stop them having a stroke or a heart attack by reducing their salt intake. Then you have to have a specific intervention, be it medication or even surgery, to help their high blood pressure. So what I would suggest is that, yes, the advertising industry may be a soft target for politicians, but what we want to advocate is to say that don't do that. Think through this as a complex problem that need multiple solutions. So there's some benefits that can be achieved on a public health and population basis, but that may not be enough. And also, what we don't want to do is be like the boy that cried wolf, that tell the population that if we ban advertising before the watershed, then the whole problem of obesity is going to disappear. Because people will just say to us, this is not happening.
All right. Just very quickly, Charley, I'll leave the last word to you. It seems Boris is pretty hell-bent on doing this in the UK. And as you know, if they sneeze, we tend to catch a cold over here. Is there a very good case to be made that you and the people you represent need to get out in front of this, and that hand in hand with the kind of advertising that you're already doing, and you might have to change that depending on what regulations come in here, that you could offer not necessarily a health warning, but an advisory to go with the kinds of foods and products that would be designated junk food?
Yes, and obviously we don't use the term sort of junk food really within this, because it is about HFSS, which I always find very difficult to say, by the way. But the ASAI and ourselves are working together, and it's all about a collaborative approach. I mean, obviously we're working with the Department of Health in developing these voluntary codes, and they're very robust codes. We've got for non-broadcast media, as well as the ones that have been in place for broadcast. We are waiting for the government to come back to us on the monitoring and the guidance elements to be put in place by the department. And so we have done, I suppose, as much as we can do up to this point in sort of showing them how we self-regulate in other areas and how we can monitor it on their behalf. We're just waiting really for them to come back to us. Obviously, this will set things in motion again, or I hope it will, but I think our self-regulatory stance and our compliance with the code will stand us in good stead, so we don't get the same blanket ban. OK, listen, I'll leave it there. Thank you both very much. That's Professor Carel Le Roux, who's an obesity physician at St. Vincents University Hospital, and the Chief Executive of IAPI, Charley Stoney. It also has to be said, although advertisers and junk food manufacturers or fast food manufacturers, etc., are a very soft target for politicians, one of the big issues with COVID and the high death rate was that a major contributory factor to a large proportion of those deaths was obesity. And one of the things that almost everybody is in agreement on is that there's going to be some form of a second wave in winter. And, this is legislation, and these are moves that are designed to mitigate that, help it. Now, mind you, whether it's going to make that amount of difference in 3 or 4 months is highly unlikely, but I suppose better late than never. Going to take a break, but before we do that, it is Newstalk, by the way. It's 21 minutes past 4. It's Mark Cagney, and next up after the break, we are going to be talking to Liam Herrick with regard to the PUP pause for holidaymakers.